We will now work with our sandbox web part that we developed in the previous demo to actually add code that gets trapped by the worker processes and handled appropriately in a sandboxed environment. Currently all our buttons do is to populate the text of a literal control saying button 1 was clicked or button 2 was clicked and so on. So we will change all of that and we will add for some of the buttons code that is allowed in a sandbox solution, and for some of the others we will put in disallowed code, and we will see how the execution environment deals with each different type. So in our first button we will put in a reference to an SP web object, but critically we will set it equal to the spcontext.current.web. So this is an allowed operation. What we can then do is to add a string variable, and in our string variable we will retrieve some metadata from the site. So we will say this web contains a given number of subwebs. So we'll go to the count property of the webs collection for the SP web object. So we haven't gone outside of the boundary of this current website, so this will be an allowed operation. And we can then change our output text to be equal to this formatted string. So let's save that and let's test that first of all. So we'll right click our project and deploy it, and we can switch to Internet Explorer and refresh our page and click our first button. So it renders our label correctly. It counts the subwebs, and that was an allowed operation in a sandbox. Now let's move on to our second button. What we will do is attempt to use the SP security class, and we will try and do the same operation as we did with the first button, but this time by using elevated privileges. So this will give us perhaps in a non-sandbox solution the ability to access webs programmatically that the current user does not have access to, but this will be an operation that's not allowed in a sandbox solution. So we will call spsecurity.run with elevated privileges, and we will pass in the name of our event procedure to run with those elevated privileges. And we won't do anything too dangerous, we'll do exactly the same as button 1, which is to count the subwebs. But this code will not be allowed to run purely because we're trying to do this with elevated privileges. Now this is an interesting area. I'm going to add an identifier to the exception catching block to say my caught error, and we'll see whether this operation gets caught by the exception handler or by the sandbox process. So let's see what happens now. We'll refresh the page and we'll click the first button, and that still works. So then we'll click the second button, which attempts to do the same operations but with elevated privileges. And notice that this is not our exception handler. Our exception handler begins with my caught error, but this was a sandbox environment trap. Now let's try in our third button something completely different. What we will try and do is use system.net.http.webRequest to potentially get data from an external website. So this would be a fairly straightforward line of code to write using http webrequest.create, and then providing a URL for the context we want to connect to. And even if we want to connect to our own website of intranet.contoso.com, we will see a specific type of behaviour in a sandbox solution. What the essence of this will show is that we are not allowed to use system.net.http webrequest.create. This shouldn't succeed in a sandbox solution. If it does, we'll say success, and we'll know that it succeeded, but if it does not succeed, we'll attempt to catch it in our own exception handler, just as for button 2. So let's build and deploy the solution again, and once more refresh the page. So our buttons will appear. Now let's click the third button. Now the error that we see is actually our own error, so the request for permissions of type system.net.webPermission was disallowed. However, it was not handled in the same way as our first error message, it was handled by our own exception handler.